Welcome, Natural Resources students again. This is the second lecture in the GMO controversy series, if you will. I neglected to mention something last time that I wanted to mention. Actually, it's an update from the Harvest of Fear video. A couple of updates, actually. One, the Dolores Wambugu, the researcher that was working with the feathery mottle virus on the sweet potatoes in Kenya, that research seems so promising, and she actually was working in the United States. The problem with her research was she was using a variant of that virus in her research to create a sweet potato, a GM sweet potato that was resistant to that virus. And she did that. When she brought it back to Kenya, however, the strain of that virus resident in Kenyan soils in Kenya was enough different from the strain that she used, I think it was North Carolina where she did her work, that her GM sweet potato did not work. The problem is that everything's in place to complete that research, to get that GM sweet potato to vastly improve the production of the crop in Kenya of sweet potatoes. But nobody's taken up the mantle. Research funding dried up for her. There is some continuing work in Uganda, but it's going along slowly. So that's an unfortunate, it's such a promising bit of research, but it has not been completed yet. The other update that I wanted to give you was on the Rusty Perry, the first gentleman that was growing papayas in Hawaii. That whole GM papaya issue blew up so bad in Hawaii, and his neighbor actually was very opposed to the introduction of a GM papaya. In fact, the neighbor was continually harassing Rusty Perry. He cut down one night over 1,000 GM papaya trees. I can't imagine the cost of that. He shot Rusty Perry's dog. He shot at Rusty Perry, leaving bullet holes in his vehicle. When Perry reported this to the police, no action was taken. They really couldn't prove, evidently, what had happened, enough evidence to arrest a person. At any rate, one night, evidently Perry caught his neighbor in some act of vandalism and shot and killed him. Perry was not charged. This was deemed self-defense since the neighbor had shot at him previously, but I just wanted you to have that update to know how dramatic, how drastic a measure people will take in this whole controversy, if you will. Okay, so a couple of final things. If you look at your GM notes, we're on major forms of GMOs, and one is pest resistance. This was quite a bit of the video, talked about BT corn, BT soybeans. Again, these are plants that have had a gene from a soil bacterium, again crossing a species boundary, placed in their genome, allowing them to produce a protein that kills off, among others, the pests that you see in the picture here. European corn borer is probably chief among them, but armyworm, western bean cutworm. This one cuts a plant off just when it germinates. This one is a general grazer. An armyworm is actually a broad catch-all category for any worm that moves in mass in one direction. Anyway, that's what the BT corn and soybean is. And so this pest resistance is bred into them, and we're going to talk about why there is different color seeds here in just a second when it comes to how do you prevent these insects from developing a resistance to that BT gene. Herbicide tolerance is another form of GM crop, and Roundup is a common herbicide, I'm sorry. You see lots of commercials for ambulance chaser lawyers that want to file a case if you are a person that has used Roundup and then developed, I think it's a type of leukemia or some type of cancer, because the World Health Organization has deemed Roundup a probable carcinogen. Think about that, probable. Actually, our own regulatory agencies, FDA, EPA, USDA, have deemed it safe, as has the European Union. the World Health Organization just thinks it must cause cancer, and that's all the lawyers need, and off to the races we go. There is a good body of research that shows that Roundup is quite safe, that it's not the threat for cancer development that ad would have you believe. Anyway, the idea here is, and I'll show you. Oops, I'll show you a picture of. Or maybe. Oh yeah. Of what I'm after here. There is bred into plants an ability to resist the insecticide Roundup. Okay. Now Roundup works on just a certain kind of plant, mainly the grasses. Corn is actually a grass. Wheat is a grass. Soybean is not a grass. So those long, thin leaves with veins that are parallel would be a grass. So this corn plant was developed to resist or not be affected by Roundup. And the idea is when this farmer planted this field to corn, the corn came up, but then so did the weeds. So then the farmer would just spray the whole field with Roundup, and it would kill all the other plants in the field except the corn, which was bred to resist the weeds. And I know I used this slide earlier, but now you see here there's a few standing corn plants. Well, these are remnant seeds that were left in the soil, germinated the next year. The farmer has then sprayed this field again. This is western Kansas again, where they're concerned about water. And so what's happening here is in order to keep weeds from growing, which would use the water in the soil profile, the farmer sprays it. The farmer could also go over it with a piece of machinery and kill the weeds, mechanically deal with that. But then you have soil compaction, you have diesel fuel usage, you have equipment wear. Most of them find it cheaper and less of an environmental effect to simply spray it with Roundup. Kills off all the weeds, but these corn plants that are resistant are left. That's what herbicide tolerance is. So BT corn is not the same as Roundup Ready corn. Those are two different types of corn. BT corn has a gene in it that kills worms, armyworms and cutworms and European corn borers. Roundup Ready corn resists the herbicide Roundup. Another one there is extended shelf life or delayed ripening. You know, so much of our produce sometimes of the year comes from South America. How do you get it harvested and up here so that it's not rotten by the time we get it on the shelves? Well, we can delay the ripening of that fruit, and that's another GM product. Improved nutrition. This is one that's come up before in previous video clips that I've shown you. The chief one I'm going to mention is vitamin A. Researchers were able to take a gene from a daffodil and insert it into rice, which made that rice have the vitamin A in it. Vitamin A is a major, maybe the major vitamin that is deficient in people's diets around the world. The World Health Organization says between 250,000 and 500,000 children a year become blind because of vitamin A deficiency, and half of those die. And so researchers have developed what's called golden rice. It's slightly yellow because it has that daffodil gene in it, but it's loaded with vitamin A, and it overcomes that deficiency since rice is the main diet in a lot of these areas. Detractors of GM products think this is horrible and are petitioning against it, fighting against it every way they can, destructively, as you saw in the Harvest of Fear video, or however. Promoters say they feel it is, to quote the previous video clip, it is immoral not to do this. They feel it is immoral not to make this available to people. Unfortunately, golden rice is not largely caught on around the world. I guess it cooks a little differently, it looks a little different, and cultural boundaries are strong. And if it doesn't look and cook right, they're not so willing to adopt it. So unfortunately, it's not been the solution yet that it could be. Immunizations, wouldn't it be great to just be able to eat something and not have to stick a needle in your arm? Or even crops that create low nutrient manures. This is a big issue here in Minnesota, where hog raising facilities have been implicated in polluting Minnesota rivers, and so wouldn't it be great if we could cause that manure not to be so nutrient dense? Okay, so those are major forms of GMOs. Concerns. Are we producing toxic food? Allergy problems. They talked about that quite a lot in the video. The idea, like if you take this BT corn and eat it, would you be allergic to that protein that kills the worm? Now you've got to understand something here. Depending on the variety of corn, that BT protein is not expressed always in the corn kernel. It may be expressed in the leaf, in the stalk, in the root, but not necessarily in the corn cob. So just because there's a BT gene there doesn't mean that you're eating it. It can be in another part of the plant. Some varieties of corn have some of it in the kernel, some don't have any. But just because it's in the plant doesn't mean you're eating it. Substantial equivalence is an important term from the video. And that's how that can be claimed, that, you know, if you're not eating it, it is substantially equivalent to, essentially the same as the non-GMO cousin, if you will. And think about this, folks. If it's a protein and that's what's usually happening here, that is created in a GM product, once it goes into your stomach's job is to disassemble that protein into amino acids. It doesn't care if it came from a non-GMO food source, from a GMO food source. Your gut does not give a rip. It's going to tear that into amino acids, which will go into your body and be used. And so the substantial equivalence is an important issue. Number two on the concerns is outcrosses. Are GMOs crossing with wild strains? And if we go back to this issue of wheat development, here's stalk of wheat, here's goat grass. I don't know if this is spelt in between, or Emer or einkorn, but basically these two were crossed a number of times to create this. So now if we find, just for instance, in the case of wheat, say, we develop wheat that is resistant to a herbicide like Roundup. We make Roundup ready wheat. So we grow a field of wheat, but in the ditch next to it we have goat grass. Because wheat is related to goat grass, the goat grass might be able to incorporate that gene into its genome for resistance, and we've created a superweed. Now this hasn't happened. Interestingly enough, wheat is not genetically modified. There are genetically modified varieties of wheat out there, but they're not used by farmers. I don't know why corn and soybean is utterly dominated by GM products, but wheat just didn't happen. So that's what an outcross could be. Another thing is pesticide resistance that you see there. Bugs and weeds developing resistance to pesticides. And the idea here, I'll go back to this picture, is that in order to prevent this, farmers plant a sanctuary. You saw that in the video where a part of the field was planted to a specific type of plant that didn't have the resistance, and the bug or the disease lived in that sanctuary strip, and then that would reduce the pressure to adapt and make them still susceptible, their offspring still susceptible to the pesticide that was being used. So you know, you might wonder, well, how does that really happen? Well, here's an example. This is my brother-in-law's cornfield, and what he did here, this is on a quarter section of land. Farmers are required for each section, depends on the state you're in, to plant a certain number of acres to that sanctuary strip. Now his plan was to simply make he had a half section, 2/4 of a section here, to make 1/4 section the GM variety, and on the other quarter section he was going to plant a strip of sanctuary and then the GM variety of corn. So if you can picture this 1/4 section of land, 160 acres here, just over here was another, bordering the same field was another quarter section, and that's where his sanctuary was going to be. Unfortunately, the seed dealer mixed the seed bags up, and so when he put them in the planter, he planted, without knowing it, the non-GM variety of corn here when he was intending to plant it over here. Didn't know that it happened. He went ahead and sprayed the field, and voila, there is proof positive, folks, that that sanctuary strip was planted. It killed off this strip of corn, and it left the 2 strips of corn on either side untouched, because these strips are GM. They were resistant to that herbicide. This strip was non-GM. the sanctuary, not resistant to the herbicide. And so it's kind of a check on the system by accident that it actually was working. In this day and age, you're more likely to see, this day and age, this is about 10 years later, the farmers plant those kernels of corn as separate items in the field, so they're mixed in, and that stalk of corn may be anywhere in the field. Here's another look, since, yeah, there's some darker purple and some lighter colored seeds. These seeds are colored because they have coatings on them, and the farmer will pay for each type of coating that help the seeds fend off fungicides, germinate better in cold, damp soil. Some are insecticides against soil worms or pests in the soil. Lots of different types of coatings are possible on seeds, and that's why you see what you see. So yeah, that's pesticide resistance. It's actually working. Actually, I've seen some planters out there that have the sanctuary bucket, if you will, on the planter. So they'll put GM corn in the main hoppers, and then they'll have another mini hopper for the sanctuary, and so the planters themselves are set up specially for that. The last thing is, are we poisoning the environment with new toxins, the BT corn monarch controversy? There is, I've posted it next week just because I've loaded so much stuff in Moodle this week. There's a follow-up to that question that was raised in the video. And since the video did raise a good question, further research was done, and I want you to see what that was. And then basically, there is not a big issue with the BT corn, but read the specifics of it. And then lastly on here, who specifically does the regulation in our country? It's broken up into 3 different groups. The one guy talked about our regulatory agency being head and shoulders above anybody else's in the world. He's pretty proud of that. And I, I'm not a big fan of regulation, but it has its place. But USDA makes sure that plant is safe to grow. FDA checks for food safety, and EPA makes sure that there's not a pollution risk to it. So we have a 3-pronged approach, at least, in addition to state and local regulatory agencies that would be added to that, all of which the farmer has to answer to, and the developers of these have to answer to. So anyway, that's where I'm going to stop this lecture. Have a good day.